Your stomach wakes you up before your eyes do. It's still dark. The fire is down to a few orange threads. Everyone around you is asleep, curled tight against the cold, and you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears because that's how quiet it is. But there's another sound, a low, grinding ache coming from somewhere behind your ribs. You haven't eaten in 3 days. You sit up slowly. Your hands are shaking, and not from the cold. Somewhere in the dark, past the trilene, there might be food. There might also be something with teeth waiting to make you the food instead. And here's the part that should terrify you more than any predator ever could. Your brain, right now, in this exact moment, is not afraid of dying. It's afraid of starving. Those are not the same fear. And the difference between them shaped almost everything about how early humans thought, moved, bonded, and eventually built the world you're living in today. Death is fast. Death is often over in seconds. But hunger, real, sustained, bone-deep hunger, is slow. It doesn't just kill your body. It dismantles your mind first. It turns you into someone you don't recognize. And it does it on purpose, because that's exactly what evolution needed it to do. We like to imagine our ancestors as tough, stoic, unbothered by discomfort. But the truth researchers have pieced together from bones, ash pits, and isotopic analysis of ancient teeth tells a very different story. Early humans were not built to endure hunger calmly. They were built to panic about it, obsess over it, and reorganize their entire social world around preventing it. Fear of hunger didn't just influence survival. It built civilization's blueprint, one starving night at a time. So, why would a species fear an empty stomach more than the jaws of a lion? Let's start with what hunger actually does to a human brain, because most people have never experienced it the way your ancestors did. Not skipped lunch, hungry. Not diet, hungry. The kind of hunger that lasts for days, where your body starts eating its own muscle tissue to keep your heart running. Scientists studying famine survivors and prolonged fasting have found something disturbing. Sustained hunger doesn't just weaken the body. It rewires decision-making, erodes trust, and pushes people toward behavior they would never choose under normal conditions. There's a famous study from the 1940s, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, where healthy male volunteers were slowly starved under controlled, monitored conditions to study the effects of famine. Within weeks, these calm, cooperative men who had volunteered specifically because they wanted to help others, became irritable, obsessive, and socially withdrawn. They talked about food constantly. They hoarded scraps. Some cut themselves off from friends entirely. One man, pushed past his limit, harmed himself just to escape the study. And this was in a lab with guaranteed food waiting at the end. Now imagine that same unraveling, except there is no end date and no guarantee of food ever again. That was Tuesday for a hunter-gatherer during a bad season. This is the part that should sit uncomfortably with you. Your ancestors weren't just occasionally hungry. For huge stretches of prehistory, food insecurity was an event. It was the baseline. Anthropological data on hunter-gatherer societies suggests that seasonal food shortages were common, sometimes brutal, and this happened generation after generation after generation. That kind of repeated exposure doesn't just create a habit. It creates a hard-coded psychological alarm system, and that system is still installed in you right now. Here's where it gets personal. Have you ever felt a flash of irrational anger when you're extremely hungry? Some people call it hangry, and they treat it like a joke. It isn't a joke. It's a 50,000-year-old survival mechanism misfiring in a modern kitchen. Your ancestors needed that irritability. A calm, patient, hungry human was a human who politely waited to die. An irritable, aggressive, hungry human was a human who took risks, pushed into unknown territory, and sometimes took food from someone weaker. Evolution didn't reward kindness during famine. It rewarded whoever secured the calories. But here's what scientists actually found when they dug deeper into this. The fear of hunger wasn't just an individual survival trait. It became a social weapon. Think about the earliest human groups. Small bands of 20 to 50 people, completely dependent on each other. In a world with no refrigeration, no grain silos, no supermarkets, food was almost always temporary. A successful hunt might feed the group for 2 days. Then what? The answer to then what is the real reason early humans developed something incredibly rare in the animal kingdom. Long-term food sharing built entirely on trust. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, do share meat sometimes, but it's chaotic, aggressive, and often tied to social status or mating access. Human food sharing was different. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, like the Hadza in Tanzania, have documented something remarkable. Successful hunters routinely give away most of the meat they catch, keeping very little for themselves, because the system only works if everyone contributes when they succeed and receives when they fail. It's not generosity in the way we think of generosity today. It's insurance. It's math. It's the fear of hunger converted into a social contract. Because a lone human hoarding food during one good week will starve alone during the next 3 bad ones. This is where it connects directly to you, right now, in the modern world. That instinct to reciprocate, to remember who helped you and feel obligated to help them back, didn't come from manners. It came from starvation math written into your ancestors' bones. Every time you feel guilty for not repaying a favor, every time a friend buys you dinner feels like it creates a quiet debt, you're feeling an echo of a survival system built around one brutal question. If I don't share now, will anyone share with me later? And that question mattered more than almost anything else in the ancient world, because the punishment for guessing wrong was an embarrassment. It was death, slow and humiliating, watching your own body consume itself, while people who could have helped chose not to. Now here's the reframe. Because everything you think you understand about ancient survival is about to shift. We tend to imagine early humans fighting off predators as their main daily threat. Saber-toothed cats, cave bears, giant hyenas, dramatic, cinematic danger. But when researchers actually reconstruct cause-of-death patterns from skeletal remains and isotopic bone analysis across various prehistoric sites, a different picture emerges. Malnutrition, and the physical breakdown that comes with it, appears far more often than predator attacks in the evidence trail. Weakened immune system from chronic food stress made humans vulnerable to something predators rarely cause directly, disease. Hunger didn't usually kill quickly, dramatically, with teeth and claws. It killed quietly. It killed by making your body too weak to fight off infection. It killed by making a mother's milk run dry. It killed by making an old man's hands too shaky to grip a spear during the one hunt that mattered. So when we ask why ancient humans feared hunger more than death, the uncomfortable answer is this. Hunger was death, just a slower, crueler, more drawn-out version of it. Death by predator was rare, violent, and over quickly. Death by starvation could take weeks, and during those weeks, you watch it happen to everyone you loved, unable to stop it, fully conscious the entire time. That distinction matters, because fear that builds slowly changes behavior differently than fear that strikes instantly. A quick threat triggers a burst of adrenaline, and then it's over. A slow threat, like chronic hunger, creates something more insidious, a permanent background of anxiety that shapes decisions for weeks or months at a time. And this is exactly what modern psychologists see in people who grew up with food insecurity today. Studies on children raised in food-insecure households show elevated anxiety, disrupted attention, and in many cases, complicated relationships with eating that persists well into adulthood. Hoarding food, eating quickly, feeling unsafe even when a full pantry is right in front of them. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because if hunger has been humanity's oldest and most persistent fear for over 100,000 years, then a handful of decades of relative food abundance in wealthy nations isn't nearly enough time to erase it from our psychology. Your brain still runs ancient software. It just runs it in a body, surrounded by grocery stores. Let's go back to the fire pit, because the story isn't finished. Imagine you're part of a small group, maybe 30 people, moving through a landscape that's turned hostile. A drought has dried up the usual water sources. The animals have migrated somewhere you can't follow. Your group has been surviving on roots, insects, and whatever scraps the land will still give up. Children are getting thinner. The elders have started giving their portions away, quietly, without announcing it, because that's what desperation looks like when it's dressed up as dignity. Now, here's a question that anthropologists have actually had to confront when studying extreme famine conditions throughout human history. What happens when the food runs out completely, and there is no more math that makes the group's survival possible? This is a part of the story most documentaries skip, because it's uncomfortable. But you clicked on a video asking why humans feared hunger more than death, and this is the honest answer. When resources became truly, catastrophically scarce, some human groups throughout history made decisions that we, sitting comfortably today with full stomachs, find almost impossible to process. Archaeological and historical records, from documented famines in more recent history to evidence found at certain prehistoric sites, suggest that extreme starvation sometimes pushed small groups toward unthinkable survival choices, including instances of cannibalism during periods of absolute famine. This wasn't the norm. It wasn't common. But it happened often enough across human history that anthropologists no longer treat it as some ancient myth. They treat it as a documented, if rare, endpoint of what unchecked hunger can do to a group of otherwise ordinary people. Sit with that for a moment, not to sensationalize it, but to understand what it actually reveals. It reveals that the fear of hunger wasn't dramatic exaggeration. It was a completely rational response to a real, catastrophic possibility. Your ancestors weren't being paranoid when they organized their entire social structure around preventing hunger. They were responding to a threat that, in its worst form, could unravel the most basic human bonds, the bond between a group and its own humanity. This is what you're not usually told in school. The fear of hunger wasn't just about avoiding an empty stomach. It was about avoiding the version of yourself that hunger could eventually create. And this is where the story of hunger becomes a story of everything else humans built. Every major shift in early human society, the move toward larger cooperative groups, the invention of food storage, the domestication of plants and animals, even early trade networks between distant groups, all of it traces back to one central, driving motivation: prevent the hunger. Build a buffer against the worst version of scarcity. Make sure the group never has to face that unthinkable choice again. Consider the invention of agriculture, one of the most transformative shifts in human history. For decades, some researchers assumed agriculture was purely a story of innovation and progress. But evidence increasingly suggests something more desperate at its core. Skeletal analysis from early agricultural populations actually shows a decline in overall health compared to hunter-gatherer populations that came before: shorter stature, more dental disease, more evidence of chronic illness. Early farming wasn't necessarily a better lifestyle. In many ways, it was a worse one. So why would humans choose it? Because agriculture, for all its downsides, offered something hunting and gathering couldn't reliably promise: a stored buffer against starvation. A grain surplus meant that even after a bad season, there was something in reserve. It meant a family could survive a drought without watching their children waste away in front of them. Humans didn't necessarily choose farming because it made life better day to day. They chose it in many cases because it made the fear of hunger slightly more manageable, even at the cost of everything else. That's how powerful this fear was. It was strong enough to make an entire species willingly accept a harder, less healthy lifestyle, just to reduce the odds of the one thing they feared more than death itself. What you're about to hear next was, for a long time, buried in academic papers most people never read, tucked away from mainstream history books because it complicates the tidy narrative of human progress. Here's the truth researchers eventually had to confront. The fear of hunger didn't just shape food systems. It shaped violence. Anthropological studies of resource conflict among both historical and modern hunter-gatherer groups show a clear pattern. When food becomes scarce, intergroup violence rises sharply. Not because humans are inherently violent creatures looking for an excuse to fight, but because scarcity activates something ancient and ruthless in the human calculus of survival. When there is enough for everyone, and the alternative is watching your own children starve, the psychological barrier against violence toward outsiders becomes dramatically weaker. This is uncomfortable, but it's important because it explains something about human history that pure good versus evil narratives never quite capture. Wars over resources, raids on neighboring groups during famine periods, and territorial conflicts throughout ancient history weren't simply about greed or cruelty. In many documented cases, they were about the same primal fear that made a hungry hunter-gatherer share meat with his tribe. Except now, that fear was pointed outward, toward anyone who wasn't part of the in-group that would share resources with you in return. Fear of hunger built human cooperation within groups, but it also built human conflict between groups. Same fear, two completely different outcomes, depending entirely on who was standing on the other side of the fire. This connects to modern psychology in a way that should genuinely unsettle you. Behavioral economists have run controlled experiments showing that when people are placed in situations mimicking resource scarcity, even artificial, low-stakes scarcity in a lab setting, cooperation within group members tends to increase, while trust toward outsiders tends to decrease. This isn't a moral failing unique to modern humans. It's an ancient survival algorithm, still running quietly in the background of every human brain, activated the instant resources start to feel limited. It's why economic downturns often correlate with rises in tribalism and distrust toward outsiders. It's not new. It's not even particularly modern. It's 50,000 years old, wearing a new outfit. Now we arrive at the final, darkest piece of this puzzle, and it might be the most disturbing thing you learn today. If hunger was so catastrophic, so psychologically devastating, so capable of unraveling the human mind and human morality alike, why didn't evolution simply make humans need less food? Why are we, as a species, so uniquely vulnerable to this particular fear compared to other animals? The answer lies in something researchers call the expensive tissue hypothesis. Human brains are extraordinarily costly organs. They consume a disproportionate amount of the body's total energy, even at rest, compared to other primates. That massive cognitive upgrade, the very thing that allowed humans to build tools, form complex societies, and eventually create everything from written language to space travel, came at an enormous metabolic price, a price paid in constant, relentless caloric demand. In other words, the very thing that makes you human, that gives you the capacity to reason, plan, and imagine your own future, is also the thing that made hunger such an existential threat to your ancestors in the first place. Your incredible brain, the crown jewel of human evolution, is also biologically expensive to keep running, and your ancestors' fear of hunger was, quite literally, the fear of losing the very thing that made them who they were. This is the twist most people never connect. We often think of hunger as a purely physical threat, something that attacks the body. But for humans specifically, hunger has always been a direct threat to the mind. Studies on the cognitive effects of malnutrition consistently show impaired memory, reduced problem-solving ability, and diminished emotional regulation in individuals experiencing chronic food insecurity. Ancient humans weren't just afraid of their bodies wasting away. On some deep, instinctive level, they were afraid of losing their minds, the exact thing that had allowed their species to survive everything else nature had thrown at them. Death takes your body in an instant, but prolonged hunger, in a very real, scientifically documented sense, can take your mind first, piece by piece, before it ever finishes taking your body. And for a species whose entire evolutionary advantage was cognitive, whose survival depended on memory, cooperation, planning, and social trust, losing your mind slowly to starvation might genuinely be a more terrifying prospect than a quick death ever could be. Think about that the next time you feel a flash of unreasonable irritability because you skipped a meal. That's not weakness. That's not a character flaw. That's 100,000 years of ancestral programming, warning you, in the only language it knows, that the resource keeping your extraordinary brain alive is running low. We live in a world now where, for a growing share of the global population, food is more consistently available than at almost any other point in human history. Supermarkets, refrigeration, global supply chains that move calories across oceans in days. And yet the ancient alarm system is still installed, still active, still occasionally misfiring in the checkout line or the office kitchen, or the quiet moment before dinner when you feel that strange flicker of anxiety, even though the fridge is completely full. Maybe that's a real inheritance passed down from those starving nights around ancient fires. Not the hunger itself, but the fear of it, a fear so old, so deeply carved into the architecture of the human mind, that it still whispers to us long after the actual dangers faded, reminding every single one of us, in ways we rarely notice, that somewhere, behind the comfort of modern life, a much older version of ourselves is still checking, quietly, obsessively, to make sure there's enough.